Merry Christmas. We've missed a couple weeks because of our communion and because of the banquet, but we're back at it now, and we're going to be having this class again for the next few weeks, Lord willing. So this morning, what's today? What's the date today? The 9th? 9th. So we'll have it today, we'll have it next week, and on the 23rd as well. So the next 3 weeks, including today. And then we'll pick it up again in January. All right? So we're at Mark chapter 5, verse 21 to 43. This is week 9 in our verse-by-verse journey through the Gospel of Mark. Let's remind ourselves of the big picture of the context of all of this, is that we're sort of in a 3-act drama is the Gospel of Mark. And we said Act 1 is Mark is asking and answering the question, so who is this? Who is this man? Act 2 is a part of the drama is this is the Messiah. That's who this is. And but then the question becomes, well, who is the Messiah? That's Act 2. Who's the Messiah? And he's not who you think he is. And then Act 3 is the final Passion Week in Jerusalem, and what happens to the Messiah when he meets up with the religious elite, the religious establishment in Jerusalem. So Act 1, who is this? Act 2, who's the Messiah? And Act 3, what happens to the Messiah in Jerusalem? So we are almost 3/4 of the way through Act 1, and if to remind ourselves of where we left off last time we were together, Jesus was in the boat with the disciples on the Sea of Galilee when a huge storm came up. And last time we were together, Jesus displayed his authority in 2 unusual ways, 2 very dramatic ways. The first, he did what only God could do. He calmed the storm miraculously by his own authority. He did what only God can do. And then, when he got into this, the territory of the Gerasenes, so again, the Sea of Galilee, here's Tiberias, here's Capernaum. Oh, it looks like this marker's getting low. Capernaum, Tiberias, and so this is the western side and the eastern side of the Sea of Galilee. Jesus was over here on the sort of the southeastern side of the Sea of Galilee in Gentile territory. We learned that was called the Decapolis, which literally means 10 cities. And it was a sort of a federation of 10 Gentile cities that went on a pact together, a defense pact and a free trade pact between those 10 cities. It wasn't always 10 cities, but that was the loose term, Decapolis, for these 10 city-states, if you want to think in those terms. So Jesus was over in this area, and he went into Gentile territory, and it was there that, remember, he healed the Gerasene demoniac, this man who was really tormented by a legion of demons. And Jesus delivered that man, and they ran into the pigs. They went into the pigs, and the pigs then ran into the Sea of Galilee, and they were drowned. So this was this dramatic healing and deliverance over in the Gentile territory. Then we pick it up in Mark chapter 5, starting at verse 21. It says, when Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. Then one of the synagogue leaders named Jairus came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. He pleaded earnestly with him, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live." So Jesus went with him, and a large crowd followed and pressed around him. So, as Mark describes it, Jesus has now gone to the other side of the lake, okay? So, meaning he's back over here again, okay? Now, as your outline says, when we're talking about the other side of the lake, you have to remind yourself, you're back in the first century. This is not strictly an east-west thing in the first century mind. They didn't think on a north-south, east-west grid. That's not how they thought. They didn't have a bird's eye view. They didn't have maps like you and I have maps today. They didn't have Google Maps where they're looking down. And so when we think of Canada, we can picture ourselves from a satellite and we see east and west, north and south, and we think on that kind of a linear scale. They didn't think that way. They thought according to their physical perspective, okay? Remember, we learned a few weeks ago when it said they were heading up to Jerusalem. How can that be? How can you be going up to Jerusalem when you're, or down to the Galilee, or up to Jerusalem. How can you be going down to the Galilee? So they were in, let me get my bearings here, Sea of Galilee, Dead Sea. So Jerusalem's here, and they're going up to Jerusalem. Well, you're not going up to Jerusalem, you're going south. Why are you going up to Jerusalem? Because Jerusalem was on a higher grid. It was on a higher altitude. So they didn't think in terms of north-south. They didn't think we're going down to Jerusalem. No, we're going up to Jerusalem because we're climbing our way to Jerusalem. Think in these terms. When you talk about the other side of your street, well, you're talking about from your perspective. You're sitting in your home, and I'm going to go to the other side of the street. But the person who is on the other side of the street, they consider your side of the street to be the other side of the street. It all depends on your perspective, and that's how they thought back then. So the other side of the sea tended to be, this was the Jewish territory, and so the other side tended to be over here, not necessarily over here, just on the eastern side, but sort of the southeast tended to be the other side of the lake, because they would be looking across from Capernaum, and the other side would be here, not over here. Okay? So, as your outline says, Jesus is back in Jewish territory now, as evidenced by the presence of adoring crowds and a synagogue leader. So we're back in a territory now where there are synagogues, okay? So he's back in Jewish territory. And a synagogue leader was the equivalent of a lead pastor in the first century, except with the added dimension of possessing a political and financial power as well. So he would have been a highly influential individual in that culture. If you can think in these terms, and this is sort of a loose analogy, the temple in Jerusalem would have been head office, okay? And synagogues would have been sort of local branches. Or think of the temple in Jerusalem is parliament, and the local synagogue is your local MP, okay? If you can think in those terms. And so the synagogue ruler would have been a highly influential individual in that community, religiously, politically, financially. So, but look what happens here, as we read in verse 21 to 24. It says that Jairus, the synagogue leader, ran up to Jesus and he fell at his feet. So this would have been a shocking sight to the crowd. Imagine, let's say back when Billy Graham was still alive, imagine Billy Graham arrives in Vancouver at the Vancouver airport, and Mayor Gregor Robertson runs up to him and falls at his feet. You think, whoa, what's going on here? This is odd. That's exactly the dynamic that would have happened here. What's going on here? Jairus, the synagogue leader, is falling at the feet of this man, this traveling rabbi. Who is this? So as you can see, as your outline says, this is desperation on display. This is a matter of desperation on display happening here. Jairus is desperate. And we read in verse 23, he pleaded earnestly with him. We can see why he's so desperate. My little daughter is dying. Please come, put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live. We learn later that his daughter is 12 years old. So we see he pleaded earnestly with him. As your outline says, this is the opposite to chapter 5, verse 17. Back in 5:17, they pleaded with him to leave. The people began to plead with Jesus to leave their region. And Jairus is doing the opposite here. He's saying, please come with me. Don't leave. I'm pleading with you to remain. So Mark's kind of doing a bit of a dramatic side-by-side here. Verses 21 to 23 in the original Greek, by the way, is quite fascinating, is all in the present tense. So it literally reads, he comes, he falls, he begs. So again, Mark is famous in his gospel for being action-packed, and it's just a quick-moving event. So Mark literally writes, he comes, he falls, he begs. So Jesus' reputation here is growing by the day, verse 24. So Jesus went with him, and a large crowd followed and pressed around him. So Jesus agrees to Jairus' request, and through the crowd, he begins to follow him home. And as your outline says, crowds are a sign of both popularity and impediment. Impediment meaning like a blockage. They're impeding his progress. So in Mark's gospel, when he mentions the crowds, he's trying to communicate one of two things. Either Jesus' great popularity, these huge crowds, or the crowds were impediments. They blocked him from going about freely. And that's sort of both are happening in this instance. The huge crowds are all around him because of his great popularity. But in this instance, as we continue to follow this story, that crowd's like becoming a blockage. And picture yourself as Jairus. Like, get right into the story in your mind. You're Jairus. You're excited. You're scared. Your daughter is dying, so you're begging Jesus to come to your home to heal your daughter. And so Jesus agrees to come. So you're hoping, it'd be like an ambulance and the seas would part and people would just move over on the road to let the ambulance go by, but that's not happening. It's quite the opposite. They're all pressing around him. And again, this is the tension that Jesus managed with his messianic acknowledgement. The more he told people, the more he discussed with people or revealed to people that he was the Messiah, the larger the crowds got. And the larger the crowds got, the more limited he was in his ability to go around and minister. But he was there to reveal his messianic reality, but he had to do this in a very measured way. And that's the tension that Jesus lived under. And that's why you often would hear him say, don't tell anyone about what happened. Don't tell anyone. He knew they would eventually tell. But he was simply saying, right now, just kind of keep it quiet till I can get out of town so I can still minister to other people. So this was the tension. He needed to reveal who he was, but he needed to do it in a way that didn't raise the Romans' suspicion because, again, a Messiah in first century didn't mean so much a religious figure as it did, though it did include that, but it was more than that. Messiah meant a political ruler. A Messiah meant a Jewish king. Remember what we learned last week in our service with Herod. There's a Messiah. The Messiah is coming. Well, that's a rival. That's a political rival. I need to kill this person. So it was a political thing as well. So Jesus had to kind of go under the radar while he slowly gradually revealed who he was, plus the tension of who they think the Messiah is not who the Messiah truly is. Okay, so we've got Jairus has come. He's begged Jesus. He falls at his feet. Jesus says, yes, I'll come. Lead me to your home. So as Jesus is following Jairus, the crowd's pressing around. They want to be healed. They want to see. They want to hear. They want to touch this miracle worker. Let's pick it up in verse 25. And a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. Now, as your outline says, the woman's condition was more than her regular menstrual cycle. She was plagued with some form of uterine condition that would have severely limited her physical, social, and religious life. So she had some type of condition that would have severely limited her life in every aspect. I'll tell you why, not just physically, but I'm going to turn to Leviticus chapter 15, verses 25 to 27. Now remember, this is a fine point, but remember, the four Gospels, strictly speaking, are Old Testament. Think about that for a moment. It's in the Gospels where the New Testament is ushered in, but the people in the Gospels were living under the Old Testament law. And so when this event happened in Mark chapter 5, they're living under the Old Covenant. And Leviticus 15 had rules involving that would have affected this woman. I'm picking it up in Leviticus 15, verse 25, where it says, when a woman has a discharge of blood for many days at a time, other than her monthly period, or has a discharge that continues beyond her period, she will be unclean as long as she has the discharge, just as in the days of her period. Any bed she lies on while her discharge continues will be unclean, as is her bed during her monthly period, and anything she sits on will be unclean, as during her period. Anyone who touches them will be unclean. They must wash their clothes and bathe with water, and they will be unclean till evening. That's the person that touches them or that she touches. So why I read that is because that's the dynamic this woman lived with 24 hours a day for 12 years. Interesting that this woman that has had this condition for 12 years, and the girl that Jesus is going to heal is 12 years old too. Again, parallels here. So Now, the question might be, so why does the Bible have restrictions like that? What's that all about? I think it's important to remember something. Unclean is not the same thing as sinful. Those are two different things. Unclean does not mean necessarily sinful. To use a sports analogy, unclean might mean you're on the bench, you're not in the penalty box. Okay? So to be unclean means, okay, the coach is saying you can't go out on the playing field right now, but you haven't done anything wrong, but you're just not ready right now to be out on the field or on the ice. So unclean means you're on the bench. It doesn't mean you're in the penalty box. And so why would these restrictions happen for a woman like this? Well, the Bible doesn't strictly or directly say, but over the years, scholars have surmised some things. There'd be physical and emotional function for this sitting on the bench for this period, meaning it gave women a time out in a culture where they had very few such moments. So clearly, this woman would have had a physical issue that would have been undiagnosed medically, like it would be today. And so Scripture gives this woman a legitimate time out to rest and to heal. And in a culture where women were very hard workers, much like they are today, ladies. But back then, they were just very hard workers. And also, there was obvious hygienic function in a world that didn't have the products that we have today. And there'd be a symbolic function also, protecting and recognizing the sanctity of blood. So blood was highly symbolic in the Old Testament with the shedding of blood. The Scripture teaches the life is in the blood. So there were boundaries placed around all interactions with blood because, again, God was trying to teach humanity something by the respect for blood. Okay, so physical, emotional function, hygienic function, and a symbolic function as well. But the bottom line is this. This woman would have lived a very lonely life as an outcast. Because of her condition, she would have been considered unclean. She couldn't touch anyone. Nobody could touch her. And, as your outline says, on top of everything else, her condition caused her to suffer financially as well. Caused her to suffer financially. You look at verse 26. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had. Yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. Now, I often like to point this out, and I put it on your outline. I find this kind of amusing. It says on your outline, interestingly enough, Dr. Luke omits this bit of information in his account of this event. So Luke records this event, but Luke didn't mention anything about her spending all this money and doctors charging her and them not helping, in fact, making her worse. Luke thought, I'll just leave that out. That's not necessary to the story, you know. So, just like Jairus, this woman was desperate. So remember, we had Jairus diving at Jesus' feet. He's desperate. This woman is equally desperate. And just like Jairus, she takes desperate action. She does what is forbidden. She touches someone, which we'll see later is why she's hiding. Why Jesus, he won't move and say, I'm not moving until I find out who touched me. Why didn't she come forward right away? Because she did something she wasn't supposed to do. She touched him, rendering him ceremonially unclean. Okay? Let's keep reading, verses 27 to 28. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, if I just touch his clothes, I'll be healed. Now, I ask on your outline, does this woman believe in magic? If I just touch his clothes, then I'll be healed. This was actually a very common thought in that culture. The idea of touching someone's clothes, a famous or influential person. If you touch them or even their clothing or anything that belonged to them, that was considered to have power. In fact, Emperor Vespasian, somebody touched one of his robes or something, and they were healed afterwards. Whatever they were dealing with was cured afterwards, much to the shock of Vespasian himself. He thought, whoa, how did that happen? So this was a common belief in that culture. So it could be misconstrued in the sense that, that she thought this was somehow a magical cloak. But that was very common in that culture at that time. And it's also very common in the New Testament. I gave you a couple examples on your outline, but Mark 3:10, where it talks about the crowd back then, said they were rushing forward to touch him. They thought if they can just touch him. Mark 6:56 talks about how everyone who healed, who even touched his cloak or clothing, they were healed. Okay? In Acts 5:15, it says that the crowds, after the resurrection now, so Jesus is ascended, he's gone off the earth, but the crowds would bring the sick out onto the streets so Peter's shadow would just touch them. And so they believed, again, that Peter was an influential, spiritual, godly man. So even if his shadow touched him, people would be healed. And remember that people took handkerchiefs and aprons that the Apostle Paul used and sent them to loved ones, believing that just because they belonged to Paul or Paul touched them, that they would have healing virtue, healing power. And in fact, people were healed if they had come in contact with these things. So is this magic? It wasn't construed so much as magic as a point of faith contact, it seems, in that culture. And as we read later in the story, we'll see that her faith was not in Jesus' clothing, but in the person of Jesus himself. And Jesus makes that very clear. I think that's one of the reasons why he pauses and does what he does. He wanted to make sure this woman understand, your faith has made you well. My cloak didn't make you well. It wasn't some magical thing, like touching a rock and then there's magic in the rock. No, he wanted her to know that it was her faith, her belief in him that affected the change. Let's keep reading verse 29 to 30. It says, immediately, so when she touches Jesus' cloak, immediately her bleeding stopped and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. At once, Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. And he turned around in the crowd and he asked, who touched my clothes? So as your outline says, there appears to be a transaction of power. A transaction of power that takes place as a result of this woman's actions. Okay? So power leaves Jesus' body and goes into her body and a healing takes place. Now, I want us to focus on here for a moment because this is an unusual circumstance here. First of all, as your outline says, this is desperation in action. Like it was with Jairus, 3a, this is desperation in action. And B, this is what's fascinating for me, is this is a demonstration of the dynamic of Jesus' divinity cloaked by his humanity. This is a demonstration of Jesus' divinity, his deity, his godhood, being cloaked, being covered by his humanity. And when we studied the doctrine of the Trinity, we talked about this dynamic of divinity covered with humanity. Let's remind ourselves of Philippians chapter 2, starting at verse 5. Paul wrote this, Philippians 2, 5 to 11. In your relationship with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus. So in other words, you should have the same thought pattern, the same attitude that Jesus had when he walked the earth. Well, what was his mindset? What was his attitude? Keep reading. Jesus, who being in very nature God. Now, you can't have the nature of something and not be that thing. The nature means your qualities, your essence. You can't have the nature of a rock and not be a rock. You can't have the qualities of a marker and not be a marker. If I have the nature of a marker, my nature defines me. Jesus, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. So Jesus didn't walk around saying, hey, everybody. He wasn't blonded. I am God. Look at me. He did quite the opposite. He slowly revealed his nature to humanity. But he didn't walk around and say, no, worship me, obey me. He didn't do that. He covered his divinity with his humanity. Okay? So rather, verse 7, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature, same word, of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself, becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. So again, for people to deny Jesus' divinity, how do you explain verse 8? He's found in appearance as a man. Well, I don't walk around saying, I'm Darren and I am being found in appearance as a man. Oh, Darren, what do you think you are otherwise? So, no, I am a man. I'm not just in appearance as a man. I am truly man, and that's all that I am. Jesus was truly human and truly God. So he had the very nature of God, but he didn't consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage, but rather he humbled himself. He made himself nothing. And he took on the appearance of a man and became a servant, became obedient to death, even death on a cross. Therefore, God exalted him, God the Father, exalted him to the highest place, gave him the name that's above every name, that at the name of Jesus, every knee will bow in heaven, earth, under the earth, every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, for the glory of God the Father. So, and Paul's saying you should have the same humility. Don't put yourself puffed up and pompous. No, you be like Jesus. Even though he was God, he didn't demand to be treated as God, but he humbled himself. Okay? So why I bring that up is we see this dynamic of God cloaked in human flesh on display in this instance here. We see the true nature relationship of the Trinity in action. The power is residing in and issuing from Jesus. But the power is in the Spirit of God being released here. So the Spirit of God is being released through the person of the Son. However, in this instance, this is what's fascinating, Jesus himself doesn't make the decision to release the power. Jesus didn't say, okay, this woman's coming up behind me. I'm now going to heal her. I'm going to release power into her body. No, he didn't know that she was touching him. He felt power leave him. And he stopped and said, who touched me? Okay? And again, we addressed this in our discussion of Jesus, the nature of God. How could Jesus be God? Doesn't God know everything? Why would he not know who touched him? Again, because we learned as part of his taking on humanity, he voluntarily limited his understanding to what the Father would reveal to him. So he had that subconscious knowledge that he was God, but he only accessed it when the Father allowed him to. Okay? So while on earth, the Son lived in submission to the Father's will. Jesus said, I only do what I see my Father do. And in this instance, it was the Father's will to heal this woman in response to her faith in the Son. And so Jesus sensed power leave his body. He stops to find out who was the recipient. And as we'll see in a moment, this appears to be Jesus ensuring that there's no confusion regarding the source of this miracle. So let's keep reading in verse 31 to 33 of Mark chapter 5. It says, so Jesus says, who touched me? And the disciples are a little bit baffled by this. They say, you see the people crowding against you, and yet you can ask, who touched me? They're saying, like, shouldn't you better be asking who didn't touch you? Everybody's touching you. What do you mean who touched you? Everyone's touching you. And but Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. So Jesus stops and says, I'm not moving till I find out who touched me. I'm eternal, people. I've got forever. I'm not going anywhere. I'm not budging till I find out who touched me. And so there would have been this awkward moment. And the woman's hiding. She's thinking, I can't admit I did this. I've rendered him unclean. I'm not even supposed to be out in public like this with all these people. I'm bumping up against people, making all these people around me unclean. I can't admit this. She's probably hiding, covering her face so people don't know it's her, because she would have been known amongst the people for 12 years as being ritually unclean. So she's probably hiding, trying to just go unnoticed this whole time. But Jesus makes this awkward. He won't move. He won't budge from this. Let's keep reading, verse 31 to 33. But Jesus kept looking around, verse 32, around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, and by the way, in another version, I think it's in Luke's or Matthew's, they write, seeing that she couldn't go unnoticed. So they add that element, seeing that she couldn't go unnoticed. So this woman finally gets to the realization, he's really not budging until I come forward here. So at that point, the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet. and trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. Now, as your outline says, number 4, this woman's fear would be a combination of her sense of awe, A-W-E, her sense of awe at her healing, plus her sense of guilt at breaking the rules of ritual uncleanliness. So it would have been this combination of her sense of awe. I can't believe I'm healed. This is incredible. Like the disciples felt awe in the boat, and they felt awe when this gentleman, the Gerasene demoniac, was healed. Awe, but also her sense of guilt of breaking the rules here. Okay? Now, again, what's also interesting, so how do we deal with this? Was Jesus not ritually unclean now? This woman has touched him. Why is he not having to go and wash and do all the religious rituals for ritual cleanliness? It appears whenever this would happen, like he would touch lepers, how can he do that? He's supposed to be unclean then. It appears that his power reverses the typical flow of the uncleanness dynamic. Like reversing the flow of a river, he reverses the flow of uncleanness. So instead of her uncleanness or the leper's uncleanness being transferred from the unclean person to the clean person, which is normally happens, my uncleanliness as a leper is transferred to you who are ritually clean. Instead of that happening in Jesus' instance, Jesus' cleanliness transferred from him to the unclean person. So he had a greater force of cleanliness that overcame the force of uncleanliness. If you can see. So that's what's happening here. He was not rendered unclean by this touch. She was rendered clean by his touch. His power was greater than her uncleanness. There's a sermon in there somewhere. I'm going to make note of that. That's pretty good. And when you hear me preach on it, pretend you're hearing it for the first time. Verse 34. He said to her, so she comes forward, falls at his feet, again, touching him. He said to her, daughter, your faith has healed you. Not my cloak has healed you. Your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering. So as your outline says, Jesus ensures that she realizes that it's her faith in his power and not magic that healed her. And he then publicly pronounces her cleansed and whole. So again, so the rest of the crowd will know, okay, she's good to go now. You know, she's been pronounced clean. Okay, as your outline says, meanwhile, back to the healing of Jairus' daughter. So this is all a distraction. Pick it up in verse 35. While Jesus was still speaking, some people came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. Your daughter is dead, they said. Why bother the teacher anymore? Okay? So as your outline says, the woman's story was wonderful unless you're Jairus. Okay? You're thrilled unless you're Jairus. He's privately told that his daughter has died. And so he is encouraged to give up his pursuit of Jesus. Okay? So it's great unless you're Jairus. So he's privately told that his daughter has died. He's received this terrible news, and he's encouraged to give up his pursuit of Jesus. So again, you're Jairus watching this woman being healed, and everyone else is thrilled, and you're frustrated. Come on, Jesus, my daughter's dying. Come on. So what they're saying is, hey, Jairus, Jesus is a great teacher who can perform the odd healing, but this is beyond his authority and his ability now. Your daughter's dead. Let's go home. Jesus can't help you anymore. That's what they were saying. Read verse 36. Overhearing what they said, Jesus told him, don't be afraid, just believe. So the implication is that the message is given privately to Jairus because Jesus overhears it. As your outline says, number 2, Jesus overhears the report and encourages Jairus to ignore their advice. He encourages them to ignore their advice. So Jesus literally says, stop fearing and keep on believing. That's literally what he says in the original Greek. Stop fearing, keep on believing. So as your outline says, he's telling Jairus to put aside the fear that drove him to Jesus and to progress in the fear that drove him to Jesus. So put aside the fear, let me restate this, to put aside the fear that drove him to Jesus and to progress in the faith that drove him to Jesus. Stop fearing, but keep on believing. 2 things brought you to me, your fear and your faith. Stop the fear now and keep progressing in the faith. That's what he says to him. Stop fearing, keep on believing. Verse 37 says, he did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. So Jairus, as your outline says, Jairus apparently obeyed because he led Jesus to his home. So Jairus must have obeyed and still maintained his faith because he said, okay, follow me. My daughter's dead, but I still have a remnant of faith here. Follow me, I'll lead you. Now, why did Jesus just bring Peter, James, and John inside the home? We don't know. Scripture doesn't say. Lots of surmising going on out there. But I think the best answer would simply be that it may have been the limitations of Jairus' home. Homes are very small then, and everybody couldn't come. So he just brought in Peter, James, and John with him as witnesses here. And then number 4 on your outline, C4, they are greeted by a commotion that leads Jesus to take charge. They're greeted by a commotion that leads Jesus to take charge. Verses 38 to 40. It says, when they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw a commotion with people crying and wailing loudly. He went in and he said to them, why all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead, but asleep. But they laughed at him. After he put them all out, he took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him and went in where the child was. So I used to wonder, how can people go from crying to laughing so quickly? It never made sense to me. How can that happen? And Jesus arrives, they're all crying, and he says that she's not dead, she's sleeping. I've been to a lot of funerals. I've not seen that transition. It never really made sense to me. But as your outline says, the superficiality of the grief is likely due to the custom of hiring mourners. This is often done. In fact, the Mishnah, which is the oral tradition of the Jews, which was written down in AD 200. So this was the oral tradition that the Pharisees had. They finally wrote it down in AD 200. We have it today. It's called the Mishnah. But it says in the Mishnah, even the poorest in Israel do not hire less than 2 flute players and 1 wailing woman. So even poor people, when somebody died, you got to have somebody mourning for you. So they would hire people to cry. So these are clearly people who have been hired to cry. He was a very wealthy man. So I'm sure a lot of people were on call there, local, and they're there crying. And so they're not really emotionally attached. So they're crying because they're paid to cry. And then when Jesus says this, oh, did you hear that? They're there as professional mourners. And Jesus uses a play on words with dead sleeping. It's a play on words there. Number 5 on your outline, Jesus' words were not mystical or mysterious, but simple and brief. So when Jesus goes into the room and heals this young girl, he raises her from the dead. Now, it's not a resurrection, it's a raising from the dead. Resurrection is when you have a glorified body and you never die again. Lazarus was raised from the dead, but he wasn't resurrected. Okay, that's an important thing to distinguish here. Lazarus died again. This girl died again. Okay, they weren't resurrected. They were raised from the dead. It's a difference. So Jesus' words were not mystical or mysterious, but simple and brief. Look at verse 41. He took her by the hand and said to her, Talitha cum, which means, it's Aramaic, little girl, I say to you, get up. Talitha literally means lamb, which is a term of affection for children. Okay, so, little lamb, get up. That's what he said to her, very tender. Verse 42, it says, immediately the girl stood up and began to walk around. She was 12 years old. At this, they were completely astonished. So Jesus' advice for her to be fed, keep reading, he gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this and told them to give her something to eat, verse 43. So Jesus' advice to her to be fed may be an evidence that she was not merely a ghost. So that, so it would be, no, she ate. He just raised this ghost and she was the spirit. No, they fed her. She had food. We saw it. Oh, so she really was raised from the dead. And number 7, once again, he calls for them to be restrained in their initial spreading of the news. This would admittedly be a difficult command to keep. But Jesus had to say it. Do your best to keep this quiet so I can get out of town eventually, okay? So, following, displaying control over the wind and the waves, and over the most intimidating demonic force imaginable, Jesus' healing of this woman's long-standing illness, and Jesus raising the synagogue ruler's daughter from the dead, leaves the reader of Mark's gospel with the impression that nothing can be impossible for Jesus. Again, leaving us with the question, who is this man, once again ringing in our ears? And that's the theme of Act 1 of Mark's gospel. All right, we're going to stop there today. Any questions about what we've learned and interacted with today? Yes? B4A. All right, let me go here. B4A. Publicly share. You know you're in one of my Bible studies when B4A1. What is that? Number 5 for B, faith. Realize that it was her faith in his power. Yes?
How relevant is the sanctity of blood nowadays? Because I know maybe some believers are refusing blood transfusions in hospitals.
Yeah, so the question is, how relevant is the sanctity of blood today? Because some believers refuse blood transfusions. I don't know of any Orthodox, I mean small letter O, Orthodox believers, Christ followers who would refuse blood transfusions. I know there's certain sects like the Jehovah's Witnesses who refuse blood transfusions because they believe that is transgressing the command to not drink blood. And so that's where they get that understanding. They think a blood transfusion is drinking blood. And the drinking blood prohibition was given as because of that was something that pagans did as acts of worship to their false gods. And so that was sort of a ceremonial thing that the Israelites were forbidden to do. Again, because of the sanctity of blood, because of the respect for blood, the role of blood, and the symbolism of blood. So just don't do it as any type of, form of worship. Okay, so it would still be maintained today in the sense of recognizing the power and the symbolism of blood, but it doesn't have the same restrictions that it did then. Yes, Walter.
This is definitely not as valuable discussion as the last point, but celebrities and rock stars are still being touched as if that's something that...
Yeah, celebrities, rock stars still being touched today as though if you can just touch them. Yes. Now it's just to say you did it. Any other questions about today? Yes.
Any reason why the people wouldn't have complained with the woman with the issue of blood?
Any reason why people didn't complain about her being out there? Who's to say they didn't? Mark doesn't record it, but they may very well have resented her initially. So who knows what transpired afterwards here? Yes.
I like your idea that she might have been veiled.
Yeah, she may have been veiled. I'm assuming she probably was.
So I had a couple friends come back from Egypt, and they alerted us, made us aware of just the impurity of menstrual women and how that they have to, for 5 days, stay secluded, they miss school, and so there's a whole move to try to help them.
Yeah. In some cultures today, yes, today it's still women are still treated this way. Other questions? Yes. Yeah, right? She touched his cloak. Yes. That's right. He felt the power go. And what he wanted to make clear was that it wasn't her belief in his cloak where the power was. She just thought, if I touch his cloak, and the emphasis that Jesus was, let me put it this way, sometimes it's easier to look at it this way. Was she thinking, if I touch his cloak, I'll be healed? Or was she thinking, if I touch his cloak, I'll be healed? And what Jesus was making clear was, listen, it was your faith in me. It's your faith has made you clean. It's power left him. Power didn't leave his cloak. Power left him. So the source of the healing was the person of Jesus. Okay. All right, folks. Next week we're going to continue on. Hope to see you then. God bless you. Thanks for being here today.